think we might be live. Hello, Anna Maria here, and I have my lovely Juliana behind the camera today. Welcome to part 4 of the Brave quilt. We have been doing this since June, which is crazy. I can't believe it's September already. I think I begin every part of this quilt with I can't believe it's the month that it is. And this month we are going to be doing the borders, and I thought really hard about how I was going to show you these borders because it's giant pieces of fabric and that can be a little intimidating, and my biggest goal with doing these videos is to take the intimidation out of the process of making this quilt. If you have questions as we go along, Juliana's going to keep an eye on those and you can go ahead and ask them. And then of course, I know lots of you can't watch this live or you're asleep in a different part of the world. And so I'll check back on the post in case you have any questions so that I can follow up with an answer. Hopefully that is helpful. So the borders of this quilt, there's a lot of borders. It's a very border heavy quilt, isn't it? There's basically 1, 2, 3 borders. And 2 of them are made from this beautiful labyrinth fabric. I can say beautiful because I designed it. And then one of them is made from this striped bells fabric, which I'm super excited about. I love these colors. And this one is super simple. The only thing you have to keep your eyes on is positioning the lighter yellow down the middle. But otherwise, you just cut and sew it exactly as it comes. This one and this one, it's kind of like we've built new fabric because I took the repeats of the labyrinth and I set circles into the squares. So it's almost sort of like we've built a new repeat. So what I'm going to show you now is cutting those long lengths of labyrinth. And what I did on the table here, and if you have your booklet in front of you, you'll see that we actually have 3 whole lengths of the labyrinth fabric cut. And then the 4th one is going to be pieced. And that just saved some yardage because there's a lot of yardage in this quilt. But basically, the way that the print works on this fabric from selvage to selvage, and I have the entire width of the fabric shown on the table here, is you have one of these kind of stripe blocky motifs right up to the edge on this side and on that side, but starting at one of the edge motifs actually is not going to give you enough. You have to skip to the second one. And what I have outlined here in this pink kind of washi tape rectangle, that represents one of your full borders, and in that border it's got 5 of those square motifs, and all these notes are in your pattern, but this is kind of like the practical real life view of what that's like. So this represents 5 square motifs. It's 48.5 inches long, and that puts the square motif on each end about 2 3/4 inches away from the edge. So you have about 2 3/4 inches here until your first motif. And when there's 5 motifs on this length, you basically can measure off the center if you want to, like 24 1/4 inches to make sure you're getting it the 48.5. So again, you can't start on this edge one, you'll have to go to the second, and then you'll have to skip one, and then go to a third, skip one, or sorry, go to a second, skip one, and go to your third one. So you'll be able to get 3 of these big pink rectangles, which represents one whole border across a width of fabric. Now our pieced one is depending on where your yardage started. I've got my pieced one outlined in orange here. This is the one of 2 pieces, and this is the second of 2 pieces. I've got that outlined in orange, and I've got these green lines on where I'm going to join it. So the instructions will tell you to again put a total of 5 units of this design motif in a whole border, but that means we're going to have 3 units in the first one, and we're going to have 2 units in the second one. Depending on how your cut of fabric lays into the repeat, you might be able to bump down. Like I could have probably bumped that all the way down to here and gotten my full, I think it's 30-inch piece out of it. But depending on where your print repeat starts at the edge of your fabric, you might have to butt it up right up next to that first one. So I don't want this to intimidate you, and I want to assure you that where that seam is, as it kind of goes in the middle of this long stripe section here, where that seam is actually ends up getting covered by applique. So no worries if your seam repeat isn't perfect. It only really just needs to set these square motifs kind of at an equal distance from each other. But the measurements that I've given you kind of give you lots of different points about that. Okay, so I'm gonna move this washi tape wonder out of the way, and just to show you a couple other things. The next pieces that we're gonna cut, and if you don't have circles, you need to go back to like step 1 or part 1, because the circles were cut the very first part of this quilt. This is the second fabric that we're going to work with, and it's called Pruned, and this is the amber colorway. And the reason that you've got such a big piece of this, even though you only need the 4 squares, is because I specifically want you to cut those squares, those 6.5-inch squares, on an intersection between these. So it has a cross kind of in the middle, and you'll see that here and at the kind of corner marks of the quilt all the way around. That's just sort of like an extra little design motif that kind of brings the lines of the labyrinth to an intersection, okay? So you got nice amounts of this fabric to cut those, easy peasy. And then with the striped bells, you are gonna cut those the whole length of the fabric. We made it really easy on you. The length of your fabric should be about 63 inches. That's 1 3/4 yards. And again, you're not really gonna have enough to go right off the edge here on that dark yellow. So just bump over and get your cuts. Your cut lines want to go down that kind of darker yellow fabric so that you have the lighter fabric in the middle. So that's easy. You just cut, I think it's 4.5 inches wide, and then the entire length of fabric, okay? Mark it out first if that helps, because you do want to keep it in that stripe motif without wiggling around too much. And then your other border cutting is very much a repeat of the first one in terms of how you're going to position the 3 borders across, and then the 4th one is going to be pieced. The difference on this one, you actually have a bigger piece of this because you need to cut out 6 motifs of this fabric, because you actually have a little corner one. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They do get cut off on this border. This one is set in, right? But this one is going to end up getting cut off. We'll cover that next month. But so that piece is going to be a bit longer, but just pay attention sort of to the layout in the booklet and where that join line is, and you're again going to be joining on that skinnier part of the motif, okay? When it comes time to sew them together, that's pretty straightforward. Just be sure that you follow the notes that have you sew them together in a place that's not the right on the edge of the motif. So for instance, on this first one, we don't want to sew together this end to that end. We want to make sure to sew together the ones that are stipulated, and you'll be able to tell that or mark it, like where your join ends are, kind of like I did with the green tape. Go ahead and mark that with a pen or something, or even green washi tape, so you know which ends are joined. Once you have them joined, you can embark on cozying up on the porch or outdoors, or hopefully it's getting to be nice, cool weather for you like it is for us, and you can begin applique. Now, the booklet actually goes into a lot of applique detail. I gave you all 3 of my favorite methods of applique. One of those is raw edge, so it's performed on the machine and with a fusible. And then 2 of them are needle turn, that is that they have a seam allowance turn back. And what I want to show you today is just kind of quickly what each of those is kind of like in terms of preparation. You can see on this one, and we used a very close color thread, so you can even just barely see the thread, but this is raw edge. Okay, so we used a fusible product on this one, and we did just a very simple kind of matching green zigzag on the machine. Super simple. The way that started was we had our fusible, and I talk a little bit about this in the first part of your quilt booklet in part 1 about fusing on the back of the fabric after you've traced the template onto the fusible. I use the 805 Wonder Under, and then the applique instructions go into a lot more depth about that. But I've got this paper backing and fusible fused on to the back of this, and I do all my worst work on camera, but I'm just gonna cut on my drawn line now, and you can see I've got fusible pressed on either side of that line. Okay, so you don't want to cut your circle exactly the size of your template. You want to trace it exactly the size of the template, but then cut it out a little bit bigger so that you have a border. So when I have that all cut, you'll probably do it neater than me, I'm going to peel that paper backing off. And instead of picking at the corner, I usually take a needle or the tip of a straight pin and score the paper. And that allows me to put on my glasses so I can see where I did the score. That allows me to just peel it up. Look at that, it's magic. Okay, so now you have what my young students would call fabric stickers. So now it's ready to be pressed in place. And I would just take an iron, position it, fuse that down, and then take it to the sewing machine and use whatever decorative stitch you would like. Okay, so you can see if we had a seam here and you were worried about a repeat picking up, you don't have to worry about it. Okay, the second thing that I'm going to show you, the second method is two different prep methods for doing needle turn applique, whether you want to perform it on the machine or by hand. So one of them is starting with a nice creased folded edge already. And to do that, I cut out all my circles after I marked them, and I added a seam allowance. Okay, remember these templates don't give you seam allowance, so we have to add it. So I just sort of roughly added a seam allowance when I cut this out. And I have a piece of foil here, and I'm gonna drop that right side down against the foil, and then I'm going to center my template where I have my drawn line. You're gonna ignore my horrible manicure. Anna really needs a day at the spa. And I'm going to use this foil to wrap the fabric seam allowance all the way around the circle edge, okay? I've shown this trick lots of times before, a few times in my Instagram, demoing the templates that I do all the time in class. It's a fun trick. And you do want to go ahead and make sure it's smooth with your fingers and doesn't have too many little jagged points, because whatever you have kind of folded back in place now is how it's gonna press. Hopefully this is hot. And we're gonna take the iron. You could do this with cardboard, cardstock, any templates that are pretty heat resistant. I always like to say semi-heat resistant because they can take a little bit, but not a lot. But there's really no reason to pass this over that. You really only need to be ironing at the edge. You're also going to ignore my beautiful ironing board. Last week, I think I showed my ironing board in the, I don't know, some video, and I immediately in DM got an offer from an ironing board company to send me a new ironing board. Funny, right? I'm like, I don't know how to take that. It's just, I'm a perfectionist, but more so about this, and not so much this, so I don't have a tendency to look at that. It does get hot. That foil gets hot, but that foil actually helps set that crease. But you want to let it cool off before you pick it up. So I always, this end of the ironing board is still hot, so I always scoot it down to where I have it ironed, and it cools it off. That's right. That's right. Thanks, Juliana. Just blow. The reason you want to leave it alone while it's cooling is because those Mylar templates are most vulnerable when they're warm. So if you pick it up while it's like wanting to relax, it's going to start getting warped over time. So I like leaving it flat while I wait for that crease to set.
Unless you want a shrinky dink quilt.
Unless you want a shrinky dink, that's right. That's a whole nother craft. Okay, so it's pretty well and cooled off now. How pretty is that? You see how it's just tucked around there? Very satisfying. I don't always use this method because guess what? Sometimes I'm on an airplane and I don't have time or an ironing board with me, right? But I do recommend doing this process just before you're about to stitch it down, okay? So I wouldn't just go press a whole bunch of these circles because they have a way of falling out over time, those creases. They sort of like will relax with humidity or whatever it is. So my next step would be to use my trusty little glue pen here and get it pretty centered. Just watch these edges here, that they're pretty equal from there. And then you can just start stitching and you've already got this beautiful folded edge. I've just pulled out my product placement. I've just pulled out, I have this beautiful collection of Brave threads from Aurifil. These are all the colors that I pulled for this collection for machine sewing and for applique sewing. It's the 50 weight. And I refer to the colors as kind of between colors. So I haven't chosen a yellow or I haven't chosen a purple or a pink. I've chosen just the sort of neutral color that sort of sits in between. So I would use a color like that and then just begin stitching down my applique with, I do go at length in your instructions to talk about it, what that applique stitch is like, but I come out the fold and then I just begin performing a blind stitch, which goes into the background and then underneath the fold, etc., etc. I usually lift and pull a few stitches at a time, okay? So whatever method you're comfortable with, and maybe even whatever method you use to pull down a binding and hand stitch it down, that's not very different from how I perform the stitching. The third and final method also is needle turn applique, but what I've done here is I have traced the line on the right side, gone and done a basting stitch right on that line, and now what I'm going to do is put on my nerdy glasses. And what I would do next, so this is just machine basted right on the line. What I would do next is start lifting those stitches out. And sometimes I don't bother to trace the line first, right? I'll just have a nice cut 1/4 inch. So I would start lifting those stitches out as I go and then turn down the edge. So I sort of lift about 1 inch out at a time, start stitching, lift more, continue stitching. And the beauty in that method is that I can, take these on the airplane with me. I could set up all my borders and machine based all those pieces in place. And then the only tools that I need to perform the stitching, needle, thread, and a seam ripper. And I'm off to the races. So that's kind of a crash course on applique. I started this week teaching here in Franklin at the factory, and we did lots of in-depth applique kind of tutorials, and I could talk about applique like for a long time in terms of like describing the stitch and what it's just like and what it's not exactly like, but that only comes from practice. I did not go to school for this. I'm no smarter than you. It just comes from spending time with the materials in your hands and kind of finding what works for you. So that's why I like to show it with a couple different methods, because I would never want me doing all raw edge machine applique to scare you away from doing the quilt because you don't like machine applique, or the converse of doing hand applique because you're worried about that. So I always like to present a couple methods so you can find one that works great for you. I think that covers everything, but before or after you do the applique onto each border, it's gonna take a minute. So just cozy up and I'll see you in a month. You're gonna sew those squares on the end of these guys. So just follow your instructions. You're just gonna sew them on the end of 2 of these, okay? Because the other ones are gonna come in. Next month is gonna be amazing. Look at this. And we're gonna cut this giant triangle situation on the corner. It's going to be so not scary. So if there's no questions floating up, it's because I'm such an amazing teacher and I've told you everything you need to know. The difference in having your daughter behind the camera is that she snorts and giggles at me. So, and I'm surprised she hasn't given me the giggles, but that's month 4. Leave me some notes if you need any help, and we will see you right around this time next month. Over and out.
Scatkin one says beautiful.
What's that?
They say beautiful.
Oh, right back at you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye. How do I end it?
You hit end live.